If you have your Bibles with you, I'd invite you to turn with me to the 21st chapter of the Gospel of Luke, Luke chapter 21, verses 5 through 19. Luke 21, verses 5 through 19. Let us hear the word of the Lord. When some were speaking about the temple, how it was adorned with beautiful stones and gifts dedicated to God, he said, "As for these things that you see, the days will come when not one stone will be left upon another. All will be thrown down." They asked him, "Teacher, when will this be? And what will the sign be that this is about to take place?" And he said, "Beware that you are not led astray, for many will come in my name and say, 'I am he,' and 'the time is near.' Do not go after them. When you hear of wars and insurrections, do not be terrified, for these things must take place first, but the end will not follow immediately." Then he said to them, "Nation will rise against nation, and kingdom against kingdom. There will be great earthquakes, and in various places famines and plagues, and there will be dreadful portents and great signs from heaven. But before all this occurs, they will arrest you and persecute you. They will hand you over to synagogues and prisons, and you will be brought before kings and governors because of my name. This will give you an opportunity to testify. So make up your minds not to prepare your defense in advance, for I will give you words and a wisdom that none of your opponents will be able to withstand or contradict. You will be betrayed even by parents and brothers, by relatives and friends, and they will put some of you to death. You will be hated by all because of my name, but not a hair of your head will perish. By your endurance, you will gain your souls." The word of the Lord. Imagine if someone said to you that one of your most favorite things was about to be destroyed. I don't know if you can think of a building that is of extreme importance to you. If you can think of a symbol or an emblem in our lives that is of great importance to you, that you think, how could that be that that would no longer be present? Recall the trauma from the destruction of the World Trade Center towers. Of course, the immense loss of life, but also for the American people, the tremendous loss of that symbol of American greatness. Imagine if the Parliament building in Ottawa were bombed and destroyed. Imagine, in another phrase or phase, if someone were to say, "Oh, we're just going to abolish Remembrance Day. We don't think it's worthwhile bothering to make all this fuss over veterans and over wars. We're past all that now." Imagine if someone said that neither hockey nor curling nor baseball was going to be on TV anymore ever again. I don't know which one of these examples would be most upsetting to you. But if any of them are, or if you can think of something along that line that would be, you might be getting a little bit of a hint of the feeling of horror that must have come over the people who were listening to Jesus as he says the opening words of this passage. As they look and gaze with wonder upon this incredible temple, this amazing building, this incredible structure, an entire compound of brilliant marble buildings and golden domes shining in the temple, shining in the light of the sun. It was an icon, it was a symbol, it was a treasure, it was the center of all that it meant to be Jewish. Unimaginable to them that this incredible place could be destroyed. Well, they knew that it had happened centuries and centuries before, but this particular temple was probably even greater than the Temple of Solomon that had been built way back 800-900 years ago and then had been destroyed 500-600 years ago. Now this temple, Herod the Great, the Judean king, had decided to take it upon himself to be a builder, to be a person who was going to leave some monuments to remember him, to be remembered by. And the temple was one of those. He wasn't a religious man. In fact, the commands of God and the worship of God meant really nothing to him. But this was a personal pride piece for Herod. And so already in 19 BC, he had begun to expand and to build up the temple compound. And for something like 50 years now, by this time, this temple had been under construction and had been continually being beautified further and further and made more and more magnificent and spectacular. And the project continued. We're talking now, Jesus and his disciples are standing there in something like 33 AD. The temple continued to be beautified and built up and made more magnificent for another almost 30 years, into the 60s, before what Jesus said indeed came upon it. And we'll talk about that further as we go along. But not one stone, he says, not one stone will be left on another out of all of this magnificent grandeur that you are seeing here. What an incredible thing. Why would Jesus say that? Well, if we've been following the story that Luke has been telling us all along through the first 20 chapters of his gospel, then in some way at least we have been prepared for this moment. Because the temple had come to stand for everything that was wrong in Israel's religious and political life. It represented the perversion of Israel's calling from God to be a light to the nations, which Jesus had been speaking about and against throughout his ministry. This present political and power structure that controlled the temple was corrupt, was keeping people from the worship of God instead of welcoming them into the worship of God. And so if Jesus and the message that he had been giving all throughout his ministry was correct, then the temple was all wrong. If God was to vindicate him and his message, then the temple, as it stood, would have to be destroyed. The temple is where everything has happened since Jesus came into town in chapter 19, when in verses 28 through 40, we hear the story of his triumphal entry into Jerusalem. He goes to the temple, and the first thing that he does is to take a whip and begin expelling the sellers of animals and the exchangers of coins from this place that had so corrupted it as a place of worship for God. He cleansed the temple. Next day he goes back, and of course the people who were in power in the temple were very angry, and so throughout chapter 20 we hear them attacking him and coming against him with these insidious questions that were designed to get him on the wrong side of the powers that be and to turn the crowds against him. He harshly criticized the teachers of religious law right here at the center of their power, also in chapter 20, verses 45 to 47. At the beginning of chapter 21, just before we began to read, he sees a poor widow come along and put her few pennies into the offering receptacle, and he draws attention to that and draws attention to the worship that she has brought, at the same time pointing to the injustice of the fact that she had given everything that she had to live on to promote this corrupt building and its establishment, to support this extravagance. Something is wrong with this picture. And so, as Charles Cussar says, the temple is where Jesus belongs by virtue of who he is, and yet is where he is most unwelcome. It couldn't be another place in all of Israel where he is less welcome, even though he is in himself, in his flesh, the God whom this temple purports to be the place of worship for. He has challenged its corruption and its pretentiousness. Having read the whole gospel up to this point, we shouldn't be surprised to hear that he now makes a prediction of the downfall of this place and of the structures of power and religion that it represents. An institution so blind to its own mission, through misguided and obtuse religious display, no matter how aesthetically pleasing that religious display might have been, it was corrupt to the core, and it needed to come to a sad end, for it was ignoring the very one for whom it existed. And so Jesus really pours cold water on those of his disciples who were marveling over this wonderful building that they were looking at. And you might wonder, you might think that as he says this, not one stone is going to be left on top of another. You might think that the question that arises to their minds is why? What are you talking about, Lord? That isn't the question that they ask, is it? The question that is on their minds is, when? When will all this be? Why would you say such a terrible thing will happen? But from that day to this, it seems that the one thing that never changes, people are intensely interested in knowing how the future is going to unfold. If someone claims to be able to predict the future, they're going to draw a crowd. It doesn't even matter if they have any credibility or not. But notice that in verses 8 through 11, Jesus, having thrown a huge bucket of cold water on the comment about how impressive the temple was, now also proceeds to throw buckets and buckets of cold water on their consuming interest about predicting the future and when the end will come. He says, first of all, people know this. There is going to be a great danger that you will be deceived about all of this. There is a great danger that you'll get distracted from who you are and what you're supposed to be doing by getting too wrapped up in all of this. There's a great danger that you're going to get scared out of your wits because things are going to get scary. In this section, verses 8 through 11, two phrases stand out. Do not be frightened, and the end will not come right away. Now, fear might be a great motivator, but he says fear will motivate you to do the kinds of things that I don't want you to do. To get angry and lash out, or to run and hide, or to just get paralyzed. The classic human responses to danger: flight, fright, or freeze. Fight, flight, or freeze. When we get frightened, we either want to fight, get our dukes up, try to defend ourselves, or we want to flee, get out of here, get out of the danger, or we just freeze and can't seem to get unparalyzed to do anything. And he says, don't give in to that fear. He switches in verse 12, the chronological reference point of what he is saying. And he says, but before all this, before this time when the destruction of the temple will be upon them, and it did happen, by the way, in 70 AD, when Rome finally lost patience with the Jewish people and the rebellions that they continued to foment against Rome, they came and surrounded Jerusalem, besieged it, and it was a horrible time that ended up resulting in the complete sack of Jerusalem and the destruction of the temple, not one stone being left on top of another. So Jesus' prediction and prophecy in verses 8 through 11 did come true, but at verse 12, he's like, let's step back for a moment and say, before all of this happens, before all this, he points them to the time that is immediately in front of them. Before the time when the temple will be torn down and destroyed, before the time much later, when the end of all things comes upon you, and he will describe that in verses 25 through 36, beyond the scope of our passage for today. Before any of that is the time that matters to you guys. And this time, right now, is a time of witness. But let's be clear. It's not going to be a time when your witness is welcome by those to whom you're saying it. You are going to be persecuted. You are going to be opposed. You are going to be imprisoned. You are going to be betrayed even by those closest to you. Some of you will be killed. It's not going to be easy for you, he says to his disciples. But remember what you're here for. Remember what your purpose really is. Verse 13. This will give you an opportunity to testify. You will bear testimony to me. Don't get distracted, he says. Your greatest purpose in life is not to have an easy life. It is not to be comfortable, to be well loved, to be accepted by everybody, to be everybody's favorite. It is to bear testimony to me. And by the way, have you noticed what I've been doing? Jesus prompts this question. Here I am, telling them, the people around us, that the thing that they've been putting all their trust in is going to end up as a pile of rubble. This thing that they've made the center of their whole life is going to be nothing but a pile of rubble. Not exactly the way to win a popularity contest, to tell people that the most cherished symbol of their public life is ruined because of the corruption that surrounds it. Not easy to be a truth teller, and so he says for you, it won't be easy to be a teller of truth about me. Your witness won't always be welcomed. Remember, even when you get hauled before the authorities, when you stand trial before kings and governors, remember what your purpose is, to bear testimony to me. How else would you get the opportunity to speak to these powerful people? How else would you get the chance to influence those from the upper echelons of society? Once you know who I really am, once you know and understand the truth, you won't need to go around obsessing over what you'll say when you're standing trial. I will give you words. Well, it's an alarming kind of passage. I mean, we're talking about wars, we're talking about insurrections, we're talking about earthquakes, we're talking about the sky having weird signs in it, and just when it seems it can't possibly get any worse, it gets personal. You will be arrested, you will be persecuted, you will be thrown into prison and hauled before the authorities. And then Jesus says, then you will have them right where you want them. Then they'll have to listen to you. The sheer immensity of this vision of wars and earthquakes and famines and plagues might so completely arrest our attention that we seldom look for something even more overwhelming. But in Jesus' vision, those dramatic historical and geological events are simply a required setting of the stage for the great drama, the greatest drama of all, his followers telling the world about him. That's the great drama. That's the thing that's going to change everything. And don't you love how Jesus finishes this section? Look at verse 18 and 19. Not a hair of your head will perish. Stand firm and you will win your life. Yes, you will be seized, you'll be persecuted, you'll be imprisoned, you'll be put on trial, you'll be betrayed, maybe even killed, but not a hair of your head will perish. Not even the tiniest speck of who you really are will be destroyed. They don't have the power to do that. Stand firm, stay with it, endure, and by so doing you will gain not death, but life. Now, what a promise. How does that make you feel? I hope and I believe Jesus intended that it would fill us with confidence, that it would make us less fearful, We shouldn't deceive ourselves about the level of resistance that we have to face in the opportunities that we have to serve as witnesses to Jesus. We live in the midst of a culture that is very different, but no less resistant to the gospel of Jesus Christ than that one was. We may not face the kinds of violent resistance that Jesus' first witnesses did, but we will certainly face resistance. Maybe looks more like complacency, inability to get anybody to pay any attention to us, maybe some ridicule, some mocking. How do you believe all that silliness? Maybe we can recognize, too, that great power in our time is not so much rising up in blunt opposition to the gospel as it is attempting to subvert and to take over our message, to corrupt our faith. Deception is a huge problem in our day. And it is not easy then till now for people to bow the knee to Christ. And furthermore, many people who most loudly proclaim their Christian identity in our day have actually built their lives and their prosperity around practices and ethical positions that are condemned by this kingdom. So are we best off just not to open our mouths, not to rock the boat, not to make a scene? That would not be the conclusion that Jesus wants us to reach. If we believe him, if we believe Luke, the gospel writer, the point is to keep speaking and to accept his promise, I will give you words. I will give you words. They may not seem very powerful, but words of witness about Jesus and the truth of who he is have changed this world. And it's interesting that if you think about the chronology of events here, Luke is writing this stuff long after what Jesus is talking about had actually happened and had come to pass. By the time Luke wrote this gospel, sometime around 70 or 80 AD, the temple had been destroyed. And the events that are described by him in the book of Acts had happened. He's looking back on events as they had already unfolded. The early disciples had been witnesses to the lordship of Jesus and to the salvation he had brought to the world through his death on the cross. They had been persecuted, sometimes severely, sometimes to the point of death. And the faith had spread all throughout the Roman Empire. There were countless stories that Luke would tell in his second volume, which we know as the Acts of the Apostles. Stories of the gospel overcoming all kinds of human hostility and of his witnesses standing firm and winning life. And just as Jesus had said, the temple had been torn down right to the ground. And one of those witnesses, a guy by the name of Paul, perhaps you've heard of him, was going around talking about us being the temple of God. We are the temple of the living God. Yes, that stone structure in Jerusalem has been destroyed. There's a reason for that, because God has a new temple. It is his people, the place where he dwells. The temple of God, that would be us, followers and witness of Jesus, who from that day to this has been the premier point of contact between heaven and earth. He is the one who leads us to God. And we as his people are the temple that point people toward him. We still have a witness to bear, even through opposition and even through pain. And that raises a question, one that I hope will bring this perhaps a little closer to home for us. It comes from a commentator named Nancy Lynn Westfield. What kind of testimony does a faithful person give in the face of death and betrayal and the execution of loved ones? Most of us, she says, are accustomed to testimonies that praise God for good times, good things, blessings of redemption, healing, rescue, and salvation. Testimony is usually reserved for the stories that declare how God brought the faithful out of slavery into freedom, how God made a way when there was no way, how God acted to save a distressed people. But these peculiar words of Jesus in this passage tell us that when we experience destruction and betrayal and loss, we are to see those very things as opportunities for testimony. What kind of testimony can you give in the face of great suffering and great hatred? Part of the opportunity to testify during such times is finding the audacity to muster the courage in the face of fear, the boldness to speak in the face of suffering. We're probably familiar with the way that the hymn that we sang earlier today, "It is well with my soul," arose out of a great crisis of suffering in the life of the writer of that hymn, whose wife and daughters were lost in a storm at sea. And as he grieved and mourned in the aftermath of their loss, he too sailed across the ocean, and near the place where their ship had gone down and their lives had been lost, he was inspired with the words of that hymn that we sang, "It is well with my soul." Another story that is less familiar, at least it was not familiar to me, is about the song "Precious Lord, Take My Hand," written by Thomas Dorsey. Dorsey was born in 1889 in rural Georgia. He was a prolific songwriter and an excellent gospel and blues musician. When he was a young man, Dorsey moved to Chicago and found work as a piano player in the churches, as well as in clubs and playing in theaters. Struggling to support his family, Dorsey divided his time between playing in the clubs and playing in the church. After some time of turbulence, he discovered and devoted his artistry exclusively to the church. In August of 1932, Dorsey left his pregnant wife in Chicago and traveled to be the featured soloist at a large revival meeting in St. Louis. After the first night of the revival, Dorsey received a telegram that said simply, "Your wife just died." He raced home to learn that his wife had given birth to a son and then died in childbirth. The next day, his son died as well. Dorsey buried both of them in the same casket and withdrew in sorrow and agony from his family and friends. He refused to compose or to play any music for a long time. But while still in the midst of despair, Dorsey said that as he sat in front of a piano, a feeling of peace began to wash through him, and he heard a melody in his head that he had never heard before and began to play it on the piano. That night, Dorsey recorded this testimony while right in the middle of suffering. "Precious Lord, take my hand, lead me on, help me stand. I am tired, I am weak, I am worn. Through the storm, through the night, lead me on to the light. Take my hand, precious Lord, lead me home." And when the darkness is deepest and thickest in our lives, it might be the time when God will plant a word of testimony on our lips. That is exactly what Jesus is talking about here. That in the adversity and the suffering and the storm and the opposition of life, I will give you words. May we have the power, the courage to continue to witness of him and his glory through all that happens in our lives.